Hi, this is God of Rabbits, and I'm here to talk to you about my Path of Exile 3.0 Fall of Oriath Explosive Arrow character. This is my only build for this league, and it's been pretty successful, and I wanted to make a guide about it. This is a companion to my forum build guide, so you can also visit the forums and take a look at that. In addition, there are some gameplay videos and a video about crafting a +3 Fire Gems bow that you may also be interested in as content that I've also created. So today we're going to talk about Explosive Arrow. First of all, why would you want to play Explosive Arrow? Well, Explosive Arrow is a pretty fun skill. It's a fast bow skill. You usually have a lot of movement speed along with it. You get reasonable clear. You get really good clear speed, and you get some interesting things like a weapon swap for single target. And so I think it's a fun skill. It's not a sexy skill. It's not meta at all right now, but it definitely does a trick. It definitely can clear Shaper. It can clear Hall of Grandmasters, which is a lot of good high-end content that you might be interested in achieving. So without further ado, let's talk about Explosive Arrow. Explosive Arrow is a skill where you shoot arrows and they explode after a short duration, the duration being about a half second if you have, what is it, less duration in. So it's like a second is your base duration. So the arrows explode and they create this fire AoE, and the AoE can overlap so you can get more explosions. In addition, if an arrow hits a wall, it just explodes after a half a second. So if you hit an enemy and you stack 5 arrows on an enemy, the duration refreshes, so they'll explode a half a second after you've done firing. But if you do it against the wall, they explode immediately, or they explode at half a second intervals, but they'll keep exploding, and it's a good way to overlap AoE on, for instance, bosses and packs to get them to die very quickly. It's one of your greatest assets is hitting walls. You can't use frost wall anymore. That interaction's been broken, but regular walls still work just fine. So enough about Explosive Arrow. Let's talk about the gems that we're using, right? So we have 2 weapons. We have a single target weapon, which is a +3 Fire Gems bow, and we have a Quill Rain, and the gems in the +3 Fire Gems bow and the Quill Rain are the same except for one of them, which is in your +3 Fire Gems bow you use Concentrated Effect and use GMP in your Quill Rain. So you use Explosive Arrow, Fire Penetration, Chance to Ignite, less duration, elemental damage with attacks, and GMP or Concentrated Effect. And you could actually use Concentrated Effect in here, but you'd have to recolor the bow or have a white socket. In which case, I mean, it is your prerogative if you wanted to do that. But I would suggest that a +3 bow would be a much better idea for a single target. Elemental damage with attacks used to be weapon elemental damage, and it used to not work with Explosive Arrow, but now that it's elemental damage with attacks, it works because Explosive Arrow is an attack skill. It doesn't deal weapon damage in the explosion, but it does deal attack damage. So elemental damage with attacks is a really great addition to the build. And also, elemental damage with attack skills similarly works with Explosive Arrow now, and it's one of your best ways to scale damage, is to get elemental damage with attacks on your gear. That allows us to make up for the fact that we don't double dip anymore, which was a great source of previous damage. The ignite damage on Explosive Arrow is not what it used to be. However, the elemental damage with attacks has completely made up for it. So now you have greater explosion damage in 3.0 and less ignite damage. So let's go through some other gems here. So we have a standard cast and damage taken setup, which is cast and damage taken, Immortal Call, and increased duration. We also link Val Haste in here because Val Haste can piggyback on increased duration, and it doesn't have any cast with damage taken interactions, so we're fine there. We have Summon Flame Golem. You can also use Stone Golem for the life regen, but Flame Golem is fine for the damage. They're really not incredibly useful. They kind of soak up damage themselves, which is the primary use of golems. We also use Blink Arrow with 2 supports, being faster projectiles and faster attacks. that's going to get your blink arrow going as fast as it possibly can, which is really important because things like shaper fight positioning is, if you have a really fast blink arrow, you can actually position out of slams and stuff like that. I haven't tried it with Atziri, but in theory you should pretty easily be able to position outside of a flame blast if you're quick enough on the draw. So after that we have our curse setup, which is a frenzy setup, and it's going to be frenzy, curse on hit, elemental weakness, flammability. We have an additional curse that we support through our Nagama Hutiki here, and you really, if you want to stack damage, you really should have an additional curse on the build, because that allows us to run elemental weakness or flammability, or perhaps temp chains, or perhaps enfeeble if you want a more defensive curse. Temp chains allows the duration on your ignite damage to scale longer, but otherwise it doesn't matter too much. You can use, for instance, well, I'll get to gearing later, but you could use, for instance, a Zoph's Heart in this place, which is easier to find, but perhaps a little bit more expensive, and it provides a similar type of thing with covering enemies in ash, which is almost like a temp chains curse. So that's the extent of the gems. You could theoretically use a 6 link here. The problem is with a 6 link in your chest, right? You really want to scale explosive arrow for single target with gem level, and so a quill rain isn't a very good solution to a single target because it doesn't scale your explosive arrow damage nearly as well as a +3 fire gems bow will, and it also does your supports. So that's why we don't bother with links here, and we can just get away with Kaom's Heart. Kaom's Heart is also, we're one of the very few builds, no, I wouldn't say very few, but we're one of the builds that can synergistically use the 35% or the 40% fire damage on your Kaom's Heart. So let's talk about the tree. The passive tree is a really nice thing here. I think it's very nicely made. So the reason that we chose, first of all, our ascendancy being Slayer is that we don't need to go and get Val Pact with Slayer, because Slayer is one of the very few ways to get Life Leech that's pretty usable in mapping instances. For instance, you don't get instant leech, but you get 100% increased life leech per second, and your ability to gain your life back after while you're attacking is much higher, and also the ability to not have your life leech effect removed at full life means that you're going to get a lot of life leech, and it's amazing how long it'll last. If you just kill a couple of enemies at the beginning of a map, it can sustain you for a very long time. In addition, we get a little bit of extra more damage. That's a nice multiplier, and then we also get an onslaught. So that's nice to have additional attack speed while we're mapping. You could play this as other. You wouldn't want to play another ascendancy as a duelist for explosive arrow, but you could play as Ranger Pathfinder, or you could flavor of the month Berserker Marauder. There's probably a Templar version and even a Witch version as well, but I would suggest that one of the very strongest versions of this is the Duelist Slayer because of the life leech. So, and the pathing, because if we're a Ranger, for instance, and we got Val Pact, first we'd have to go up to Val Pact, and then in addition, we would have to travel into Duelist, through Duelist, and then we want to end up in Templar and probably in Witch as well, in which case we'd probably end up dropping Blood Magic and become a mana build. And I think that that's probably not in your interest if you want to stay a more pure explosive arrow build. So we get, as our keystones, we get Blood Magic, we get Elemental Equilibrium, and we get Elemental Overload. Blood Magic is incredibly useful because, first of all, we get the extra life behind it, but explosive arrow, it casts very quick, or it attacks very quickly. Your main hand, you get, my attack speed is at base 0.18 seconds, and buffed it's much faster with your onslaught and with your additional attack speed on kill and stuff like that. So you're talking about burning an incredible amount of mana, and when you have a lot of regen and a lot of life, it's not an incredible amount of life. So you're best suited by going to blood magic and being able to support it. And then on top of that, we want to get elemental equilibrium. The way we proc elemental equilibrium is that we have no flat fire damage on gear whatsoever, and we have either lightning or cold damage on gear. So you can get it on gloves, you can get it on rings. You could theoretically get it on your offhand bow, but if you're using a quill rain in your main hand, you definitely don't want to be relying on it in your offhand, because then you wouldn't be able to set up elemental equilibrium unless you had it otherwise on gear. Elemental overload is nice because you get the more damage multiplier. Elemental equilibrium we don't really support any specific way. You could, for instance, run Orb of Storms, especially if you were losing a curse, for instance. You could run Orb of Storms or maybe faster attacks here in order to make a faster frenzy. But Orb of Storms would be able to proc elemental overload very easily. But you can just proc it by shooting Quill Rain very quickly, because your attack speed is very fast, so you can just belt out arrows and then at some point you'll crit. On your offhand it's a little bit harder to proc, but it's generally up, and so there's not a huge problem. You get 8 seconds of elemental overload at that point, so it doesn't take as much effort to proc as you would think, even with base crit. You can get like 120% increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently on your boots, which will improve the situation dramatically and make sure that you have elemental overload up much more of the time. But that's not it's not incredibly necessary. I find it's up during mapping often. Other than that, we're looking for resistances, jewel sockets, much life, fire damage. There's some other things that you can get on the tree. If your jewels aren't very good, it takes a long time to get jewels, and you're really fighting a tough meta right now to get fire damage jewels. So you can, for instance, remove this jewel socket and get these nodes are pretty good, Catalyze is pretty good, Amplify is pretty good. I don't feel like the need to get area damage is great. Area damage doesn't scale your ignites, which isn't a huge amount of your damage, but it helps to reinforce all your damage. So so you're really looking at just a small AoE, which is a quality of life, but this isn't the greatest node, I think. Catalyze is a fairly strong node, and in lieu of a jewel socket, you should definitely be looking at Catalyze. In general, this is important to get reduced reflected damage. That mitigating reflect is very important in explosive arrow builds, but in general, just life, fire damage, follow the tree as closely as you can, and you'll do very well. As far as Pantheon, you really want Soul of Yulgul on your Minor God power because of the reduced reflected damage taken. That and the 10% here and a Ruby Flask is what is going to keep you alive as you scale your damage higher and higher. When you have less damage, it's really hard to kill yourself reflect-wise with all of this. But as you scale your damage higher and higher, I can tell you now, for instance, if I hit a pack with 2 mobs with elemental reflect, I could very easily one-shot myself on less than a 5 stack. So you really want to minimize the amount of reflected damage you take. So that's the tree. Let's talk about gear, right? The first thing you need is a Quill Rain. This is probably the most important thing in the build. It's probably the thing you should get earliest, a 6-link Quill Rain. They're not that expensive. You're looking at about 200 chaos, maybe a little bit more or less, depending on the time of the league. You're looking at Kaom's Heart. Kaom's Heart is great for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. You have no need for sockets in this position. It gives you an incredible amount of life. It allows you to scale life to an incredibly high degree. This is one of the very few builds where it's not hard at all to get 8,000 life. For instance, you don't have to go all the way around the Scion life. You just kind of go through the Scion life wheel and get 8,000 life. So you probably want Devoto's Devotion on your helmet. You can do Hrimnor's Resolve, but Hrimnor's Resolve is slightly harder to gear. This version of the build, since you don't start in Ranger start, you lose about 50 dex. So you're going to need a little bit more dex on gear than a Ranger, for instance. Maybe a little bit less than a Marauder, but this is a great way to get a big chunk of dex without working very hard. And Hrimnor's Resolve gives you cold resistance, but the dex chunk on here is really nice, and the 20% movement speed is really nice. This character has a base of 61% movement speed. Now I took Caitlyn kill, and I have movement speed on my belt as well. So you're looking at, if you don't take those, you'll have 50% movement speed increase, and then if you remove the Devotos, you go down to a base 30% on your boots, and you should always be using 30% boots. But you kind of want Devotos for that increased movement speed. It's really, 61% as a base is a really good start for a fast character. As far as quivers, you want 2 rear guards. Rear guards are the shield quiver. They give you an incredible amount of block chance, and then you want both of them corrupted, because you don't use the broadhead arrow quivers implicit whatsoever. So you want fire damage leached as life on your main hand Quill Rain, and on your offhand you want fire damage leached as life or +1 arrow. I chose fire damage leached as life, and so that will work out well for you either way. So after that, you want to get a Nagamahu Tiki with +1 curse for your total deep setup. If you can't afford a +1 curse, a Nagamahu Tiki is good. Azov's Heart is another good choice. Nagamahu Tiki is going to give you slightly more damage and give you slightly more options as far as your second curse. So I would recommend the +1 Nagamahu Tiki. For mapping, you can just switch out Bisco's Collar as long as you're not using the fire resistance that you get from a Nagamahu Tiki. You see I lose a little bit of life, but I still have 7,900 life while I'm wearing Bisco's. And so Bisco's provides a great amount of utility as far as, getting extra money drops. And if you don't need the fire res, then you're perfectly well capable of swapping the two out. As far as the rest of gear, you want accuracy, you want fire damage, you want resistances, and you want a big chunk of life on everything. As much life as you can possibly get. Opal rings are nice, but you can get overall elemental damage with attack skills goes up to 42%. So your best chance to get good gear is to get elemental damage with attack skills on all your gears, including your belt. You're probably going to want one nice dex roll. I got the dex roll on my boots, so one nice dex roll here and the dex roll on your Devotos is all you need to work. And then you can get movement speed on your belt. It's a good prefix to have. It's not necessary. And again, you want that flat lightning damage anywhere on your build. With this build, your base accuracy is about 79%. And so adding accuracy is really important for your single target. You don't want to miss when you have a really, really slow attacking single target. You can see that these arrows, they go out, but they're not super fast. They're not like my Quill Rain, which just attacks with huge attack speed. So you don't want to miss with your single target, so you want to get as much accuracy as you can afford. So I got accuracy on my gloves, and I got accuracy on this ring here, and that brings my accuracy to 86 or 87%. If you could get more accuracy, you could theoretically go up to 90% with another huge accuracy roll, which would be quite amazing. Because, like I said, you really don't want to miss with your single target. As far as flasks go, just jam some life flasks. Quicksilver is great. A ruby is kind of necessary to mitigate your own reflect damage. You can use a Dying Sun here. They cost a little bit more, and the utility is marginal. I just kind of like a good ruby flask that'll last a long time, and that gives me something else. So get reduced charges or movement speed or something like that. This will allows you quite a bit of utility. And then no offensive flasks here. I don't really think they're really great at this point because of boss life changes. They're not always up, so I prefer defensive flasks. That's about it, I believe. I've gone over mechanics, gems, the tree, gear. As far as top end power goes, you don't need as much damage as I have to clear content well. You can clear content like Guardians with about 150% less damage than I have very easily. For hardcore, I would recommend you drop the damage by about 100 to 150% as well in order to mitigate the chance of you killing yourself to reflect. What kills you? Well, reflect can certainly hurt. And one-shots, especially elemental one-shots, can really kill you. There's not a great way to mitigate elemental damage with this build. The Wise Oak is a reasonable choice, but with the different configurations you have, like Nagama Hutiki versus Abyssco's Collar, it's really hard to get the maximal impact of a Wise Oak, for instance, to mitigate elemental damage. But it's an option you have. I would suggest that I don't find it useful. I would not want to juggle multiple pieces of equipment to put me in a position to have that additional mitigation. I have the ability to generate endurance charges through the Red Nightmare. This is a great addition to the build because you get 5% chance to block and 15% chance to get an endurance charge on kill, which means that you have 3 endurance charges at all times when you're mapping, which is amazing. That 5% is added on top of your rear guard, so that's like up to 25 maybe, I'm not entirely sure. So you've got more block than a shield character would typically have if you have a Red Nightmare. If you don't have a Red Nightmare, I would suggest throwing a good jewel in here and just forget about it. The ability to generate endurance charges just is effectively a life multiplier, but it doesn't mitigate elemental damage, which is, again, your biggest weakness. Having a huge life pool is great, but you're kind of still a tin can. Cap your resistances, not hard to do with this build. You have 5 slots to add resistances plus jewels. Get really good jewels. You want fire damage, you want projectile damage, you want area damage later, because area damage doesn't scale ignites, but again, your ignite isn't your primary source of damage. Get good jewels and then go to town. This build's really fun. It's a great top end build. As far as like spending a lot of money to create something nice, it can get you a lot of mileage because you can do almost all content in the game. You can see that I've done Val Temple. It was a walk in the park. I've done Hall of Grandmasters, again a walk in the park. You're going to find that you can kill almost everything. The only thing that I have not been yet successful at is Uber at Ziri, and it's mostly because the cost of entry is really high, and I don't feel like spending the time to figure out how to get Uber at Ziri down in a reasonable amount of time. So that is a bridge too far, but we'll see in the future. I think that this is probably an Uber at Ziri capable build, especially if you have a lot of experience in that arena. So that's the build. I hope that you enjoyed this. Again, you have the companion being my forum post and my other videos on Explosive Arrow. So there's a lot of content that I put out for this, and you can take a look at all of it. If you have any questions, the best way is to leave a comment here or on the forums. I'm fairly active in answering them, so let me know what you think of the build if you take it out for a spin, and I hope that you enjoy Explosive Arrow in this 3.0 Fall of Oriath League, the Harbinger League. So thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.